Tonight's debate is sponsored by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and is part of its Cicero's Podium debate series on great issues. The series travels the country seeking to elevate civil discussion and promote genuine intellectual diversity on American campuses and to inspire the rising generation to think about books and ideas that have shaped our experience in ordered liberty. To learn more about ISI or to become a student or faculty member for free, please take literature at the back of the chapel or go to isi.org. I'd also like to thank Wheaton College itself and the Wheaton Conservatives for allowing this debate to happen tonight. I'll introduce our two debaters for you. To my right is Professor Peter Kreeft. Peter Kreeft is a professor of philosophy at Boston College. He received his bachelor's degree from Calvin College in 1959 and his master's and PhD from Fordham University in 1961 and 1965, respectively. He taught at Villanova University from 1962 to 1965 and has taught at Boston College since 1965. He is author of numerous books, including C.S. Lewis for the Third Millennium, Fundamentals of the Faith, Catholic Christianity, Back to Virtue, and Three Approaches to Abortion. In addition to Socrates Meets Sartre, Professor Kreeft's most recent Ignatius University Press books include You Can Understand the Bible, The God Who Loves You, and The Philosophy of Tolkien. To my left, Professor Michael Tooley. Michael Tooley is Professor of Philosophy and College Professor of Distinction at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he has taught since 1992. As an undergraduate, he studied mathematics and physics, and then philosophy at the University of Toronto, then went on to graduate study at Princeton University, where he wrote a dissertation directed by Walter Kaufman on cognitive significance of theological statements, completing his PhD in 1968. His major publications include Causation, A Realistic Approach, 1987, Time, Tense, and Causation, 1997, which was translated into Italian in 1999 as Natura del Tempo, and a forthcoming co-authored work with Alvin Plantinga entitled Knowledge of God. He has held 5-year research appointments at the Australian National University on 2 occasions, was president of the Australasian Association for Philosophy in 1984, received a Japan Society for Promotion of Science Fellowships for research in Japan in 1999, and is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Both our debaters have agreed to a pretty tight schedule, so without further delay, I will introduce Professor Tooley.
Thank you very much. Okay, the title of the debate is God Dead? Christianity versus Theism. I'm going to be focusing on the question of whether or not God exists. And I'll start off by looking at theism, atheism, and the concept of God. First, the concept of God that is relevant here is that God is by definition omnipotent, that is all-powerful, omniscient, that is all-knowing, morally perfect, immaterial, a person, and the creator of the physical universe. Theism is the view that God, so defined, exists, and atheism is the view that God, so defined, does not exist. 2 arguments for atheism. The first argument I'll set out is what I'll call the argument from logical probability, and what it attempts to show is that atheism is the default position. The second argument is an inductive or evidential or probabilistic version of the argument from evil. So first then, the argument from logical probability. The idea is here that in the absence of any positive ground for evidence in support of belief in the existence of God, it's reasonable to hold that God does not exist, and unreasonable either to believe in the existence of God or to suspend belief on this matter. That's the claim. What's going to be the argument for it? My preferred way of formulating the basic argument here is in terms of the idea that it's reasonable to view the following 3 possible deities as a priori equally likely. First, omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good creator. Secondly, an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly evil creator. And thirdly, an omnipotent, omniscient, and morally indifferent creator. So the claim is those are all a priori equally likely. But that's right. The a priori probability that God exists cannot be greater than 1/3. And so the initial a priori probability that God does not exist must be at least 2/3. So consequently, in the absence of any positive evidence for the existence of God, it's reasonable to believe that God does not exist. Atheism, therefore, and not agnosticism or theism, is the default position. Second argument, the inductive, evidential, probabilistic argument from evil. Some versions of the argument from evil, known as logical incompatibility versions, attempt to establish the following very strong claim. There are facts about undesirable states of affairs in the world that entail the non-existence of God. But I'm not putting forward an incompatibility version of the argument from evil, and I'm not defending that thesis. The thesis I'm defending is associated instead with what are known as inductive or evidential or probabilistic versions of the argument from evil. And the relevant thesis is this. There are facts about undesirable states of affairs in the world that make it unlikely, indeed extremely unlikely, that God exists. So, a quick overview of what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to mention some examples of some important evils. I'm then going to offer a formulation of the evidential argument from evil. I'll then talk about the justification of the crucial inductive inference that the argument involves. And the conclusion will be, unfortunately, that the inductive argument from evil is a sound argument. So first of all, then, examples of some important evils. One thing I have in mind here are extreme moral evils. Think of the Hitlers, the Stalins of this world. Think of acts of genocide. The second thing is the suffering endured by innocent children, maybe starvation, serious illnesses, often, unfortunately, abuse by adults. The third important evil are the sufferings of animals. Consider, for example, the existence of carnivores, the fact that some animals like to munch on other animals. Fourthly, there's the suffering that adults endure as a result of terrible diseases. Think of cancer, Alzheimer's, and so on. Fifthly, there's the suffering that results from natural evils, such as tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes. Sixthly, there are deaths due to poverty-related causes. According to POGA of Colombia, this is about 18 million deaths a year, or about 300 million since 1990, dwarfing wars and so on. Seventh, there are design faults in you and I, in human beings, design faults that contribute greatly to human suffering and unhappiness, such as, for example, the following. There's a human spine. Breakdown of disc leads to serious pain and disability. There's the fact that, interestingly, women are more susceptible to lung cancer than men because of the gastrin-releasing peptide receptor gene. There are declining hormone levels that accompany aging, leading to things like osteoporosis, broken bones, and so on. There's the physical and mental deterioration that accompanies aging. There's the weakness involved in the body's defense mechanisms. And then, last but not least, there's the wonder of human mortality. Finally, the design faults in the world outside of human beings that contribute greatly to suffering, either suffering by humans or by other sentient beings. I've already mentioned the case of carnivorous animals, and that goes back, of course, millions of years. There's also the fact that resources on this planet are too limited to provide for populations of humans and other animals that are expanding at natural rates. So this brings me to the next section, the formulation of the evidential argument from evil. My formulation is a bit compact. It could be expanded, but I prefer this more compact formulation. First, if there is an omnipotent, omniscient being, then there are cases where that being intentionally allows natural disasters, such as tsunamis that kill thousands of innocent people. Think of the Southeast Asian tsunami of a few years ago that killed more than 200,000 people. Secondly, the property of intentionally allowing natural disasters that kill thousands of innocent people is a wrong-making characteristic of an action, and a very serious one. Thirdly, in many cases, we do not know of any right-making characteristics that we have good reason to believe are both present in the cases in question and also sufficiently serious to counterbalance the relevant wrong-making characteristics. So in the case of the Southeast Asian tsunami, there may have been right-making characteristics, but either they're ones that we don't know about or that weren't sufficiently strong to counterbalance the killing of more than 200,000 innocent people. Therefore, if there is an omnipotent, omniscient being, then there are specific cases of such a being's intentionally allowing natural disasters that kill thousands of innocent people, where there's a wrong-making property that is not, as far as we know, counterbalanced by right-making properties. And that qualification, as far as we know, is quite crucial. But here you get the inductive inference in the argument. So I've put it down as not as therefore, but therefore it is likely that. So what's likely in view of 4? 5 says, if there's an omnipotent, omniscient being, then there are specific cases of such a being as intentionally allowing natural disasters that kill thousands of innocent people, where the total wrong-making properties of the action are not counterbalanced by the total right-making properties, either known or unknown. So the move from 4 to 5 is a move from what's true relative to the properties that we're aware of to a claim of what's true relative to all morally significant properties, unknown as well as known. 6, an action is morally wrong, all things considered, if it has wrong-making characteristics that aren't counterbalanced by its right-making characteristics. Therefore, if there is an omnipotent, omniscient being, then that being allows things to happen in situations where it's morally wrong to do so, all things considered. And therefore, there is no omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect being. But if God exists, he is by definition omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. And therefore, finally, God unfortunately does not exist. All of this argument is deductive, although I haven't filled it out completely, except for the following crucial inference. The inference from 4 that if there's an omnipotent, omniscient being, then there's specific cases such a being is intentionally allowing natural disasters that kill thousands of innocent people, where there's a wrong-making property that's not, as far as we know, counterbalanced by right-making properties. And the conclusion is it's likely in view of that if there is such a being, then there's specific cases of such a being as intentionally allowing natural disasters that kill thousands of innocent people, where the total wrong-making properties of the actions are not counterbalanced by the total right-making properties, either known or unknown. So, the crucial question is whether that inductive step can be justified or not. So the question is, how can one determine whether this inductive inference is a sound inference or not? The answer is that this can only be determined by bringing inductive logic, understood as the theory of logical probability, to bear upon the question. And so the reason why there's been relatively little progress on this issue is that philosophers have failed to do that. They've discussed things in a very informal way. Now, doing that, however, turns out to be a somewhat complex operation that I'm not going to attempt to describe in detail here tonight. For those of you who are interested in the details, however, those details are now available in a book that I recently co-authored with Professor Alvin Plantinga. I think it was officially published on April 25th. It's called Knowledge of God, and it's a debate volume which is published in Blackwell's Great Debates in Philosophy series. What I'm going to do is simply try to convey to you the general idea behind the technical argument. And the general idea involves considering the different possibilities that there are with regard to morally significant properties that we humans may not be aware of, and then calculating the probability that an action is wrong relative to those morally significant properties that we're aware of. The probability of that will also be morally wrong relative to the totality of morally significant properties, both known and unknown. Now what I'm going to do is to illustrate the general idea by focusing on an extremely simple case. It's a case where an action has only one known wrong-making property and has no known right-making properties. And moreover, there are two unknown morally significant properties that it's being assumed are equally weighty, one of which is a right-making property and one of which is a wrong-making property. So consider then the following diagram, which represents an action A that has one known wrong-making property and no known right-making properties. Let me explain this diagram very quickly. You'll see that there is a vertical line, and the idea is on the right there are actions that are morally right actions, and on the left you have morally wrong actions. And you can see a rectangle there on the left with A on it. That represents action A, and it's shown as having a known wrong-making property. So it's the left of the axis. There's also the horizontal axis, and the idea is that arrows above the axis are going to represent known right-making, wrong-making properties. Arrows below the axis will represent unknown right-making, wrong-making properties. So, as diagrammed, action A has a known wrong-making property. But it could be that action A is not morally wrong, all things considered, because there are, we're assuming, two unknown properties, one right-making, one wrong-making. So now we have to consider the different possibilities that there are with regard to the possession of either of those properties by action A. And when you do that, you can see quickly that there are precisely four possibilities. First possibility is that action A doesn't possess either the unknown right-making property R or the unknown wrong-making property W. The second possibility is that action A possesses right-making property R, but not the wrong-making property W. The third possibility is that action A possesses property W, the wrong-making property, but not the unknown right-making property R. And the fourth possibility is that action A possesses both property R and property W. So those are the four possibilities. And so let's see how things turn out under those four possibilities. The diagram you're now looking at shows the case where neither the right-making nor wrong-making unknown properties are present. And so action A just has the moral status that it has based on the known wrong-making property. So it's morally wrong and morally wrong to the same degree. The second possibility is that the unknown right-making property is present, but not the unknown wrong-making property. And as you can see, what has happened is that action A has been shifted from the left of the vertical line, the class of a morally wrong action, to the right. And so it's now an action that's right, all things considered. And that's happened because I've assumed that the unknown right-making property was of sufficient magnitude, sufficiently weighty, to outweigh the known wrong-making property. So in case of possibility 2, the action is morally right, all things considered. Third possibility is where the unknown wrong-making property is present, and that means the action is wrong, but now it's going to be more wrong. And then the final possibility is where they're both present, they cancel out, and the action is morally wrong. And so the conclusion in this special case is that action A winds up wrong 3 times and morally permissible once. So it's 3 times more likely to be morally wrong than morally right. What's the general rule? The answer is that by applying inductive logic, what one can show is that if there's an action that is morally wrong judged on the basis of known morally significant properties, then it's going to be, the probability it's wrong, all things considered, is going to be greater than 1/2. And then the question is, what happens if you have 2 or more apparent evils? The answer is that if there are n events, each of which is such that judged simply by known right-making, wrong-making properties, it would be morally wrong to allow that event, then the probability that none of those events is really wrong, all things considered, is a fraction 1 over n plus 1. So if you have 5 apparent evils, the probability that none of them are really evil is 1/6. And the result is, the upshot is that by considering n apparent evils, one can show the probability that God exists must be less than 1 over n plus 1. And so, since the number of apparent evils in the world is very large, it turns out that the probability that God exists is extremely small. So to sum up, I've set out 2 arguments for the conclusion that God does not exist. The first was the argument from logical probability, which establishes the view that the non-existence of God is the default position. And the second was a probabilistic version of the argument from evil. And what I've argued there is that if there are n apparent evils, then the probability that God exists cannot be greater than 1 or n plus 1. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Kreeft.
I'm supposed to defer my response to that to the 4th place, right? And present my own position. All right. Well, Michael, I'm privileged to be on the same platform with you. Any friend of Alvin Plantinga's is a friend of mine. And if he wanted to write a book with you, you must be a good man. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not even a scholar. I like to think of myself as a kind of Aristotelian. Aristotle's the master of common sense. So I will give you what I think are the 5 most commonsensical arguments for the existence of God. One of them is the fact that you exist. The universe exists. We're here. Yeah, so? Well, there's this principle of causality that is used in all common sense reasoning and in all science, which says that an effect cannot exist unless it pre-exists in its cause. You can't give what you don't have. If you didn't have parents, you wouldn't exist. You didn't have grandparents, they wouldn't exist, etc., etc. About 20 years ago, there were 3 cosmological theories around about the origin of the universe. One was the steady state theory. The universe has always been here in a basic state of steadiness or homeostasis. The other was the oscillating universe theory. We know that the universe was expanding. We knew that ever since Hubble discovered the redshift in the 20s. But maybe the universe will contract again and then expand again and then contract again like an eternal accordion. So the contractions and expansions have a beginning, but the universe itself has no beginning. The third was the Big Bang theory. The universe has an absolute beginning. All space, time, and matter came into existence simultaneously, suddenly. All the atheists in the world favored theory 1 or 2. They all said the third thing can't be true because that's creationism. As a matter of fact, there's not a responsible scientist in the world today who does not believe the Big Bang theory. It's been conclusively proved by many different lines of independent evidence. So I ask you how there can be a Big Bang without a Big Banger. If you suddenly saw a large purple rabbit appear on this desk, would you say, oh, well, rabbits happen? No. You would use the principle of causality. You would say, well, maybe that rabbit fell down from the ceiling. Or maybe it jumped up from the table. Or maybe it's a fake rabbit. He's a stage magician. Maybe it's a balloon. And if all physical explanations failed, you would then, in a kind of a feat of desperation, resort to a psychological explanation. The rabbit's not there. He's hypnotizing us. It's an illusion. And if even that were refuted, as a last resort, you'd take refuge in miracle. You'd say, well, there's got to be some cause. If it's not any natural cause, either physical or mental, it's got to be a supernatural cause. The idea that there's a miracle-working God does not contradict the laws of causality. It just posits a supernatural rather than a natural cause. Nobody says rabbits just happen. Nothing that has a beginning, nothing that has a history, nothing that changes, simply happens. It has a cause, including the universe, which is the sum total of all things that change. I suppose back in the days of Newton, you could believe that time and space were a kind of given absolute, and all events could be graphed on a space axis and a time axis. You can't believe that, of course, after Einstein. Space and time are relative both to each other and to our observation and to matter. So all the time in the universe is all the matter in the universe, or rather is relative to all the matter in the universe. Time is sort of like the scent that an animal throws off as it's running. Therefore, since all time began at this singularity of the Big Bang, we have, it seems, scientific evidence for not the full definition of God that Professor Tooley gave at the beginning. We don't have the right to conclude that there is a God who knows everything or that is omnipotent, but we do have a right to conclude that there is some cause adequate to explain the existence of the entire universe. And since you can't give what you don't have, this cause must exist. Second, if you look at the universe very carefully, the more carefully you look at it, the more intelligence you find in it. There were, I don't know if the story is apocryphal or true, it doesn't matter, it's a kind of a myth, two scientists working at the first Cape Canaveral moon rocket. And one was an atheist and the other was a theist. And the atheist was an art collector. And after the rocket successfully took off, they were walking past an antique store. And the atheist said, "Oh, that looks like a Turner." And he said, "No, it's only $5,000. It must be a copy. What a brilliant copy. Maybe I can buy that. Gee, I wonder who painted it." And the theist looked at it and said, "Nobody, it just happened." The point, of course, is that the universe is at least as complexly arranged as a painting, much more so. By analogy, why do you think the universe simply happened without design? I'm not arguing all the details of the so-called intelligent design movement. I don't think that's a properly scientific argument. It does seem to me to be a commonsensical argument. But probably the most common argument for the existence of God in any culture in the world is the argument from design. The universe seems to be a script. Almost all ancient cultures developed the art of sign reading. This is not a properly controlled scientific art, but it is a properly human art. When I point to my dog's food, I have a very dumb dog. He's a basset hound. He cannot understand pointing. He doesn't look at his food. He comes and sniffs my finger. Well, words are like pointing fingers. They're intentional. They don't just exist. They point at things. And the art of sign reading, which almost all ancient cultures have developed to a higher degree than we, consists in looking at the significance of things, looking at things and not just words as signs, as pointing to things. We would look at a work of art and say it has a meaning, it has a significance. A dog would just look at it and say, well, it's a place to pee. Now, in a sense, the scientific method tells us to act like dogs, to confine ourselves to hard data, and that's quite proper. But as human beings, we don't confine ourselves to hard data. We have an inner commonsensical intuitive eye, and we say that something as cleverly designed as a universe has to have a clever mind behind it. So there's your argument from design. Those are both external arguments. My third and fourth argument come from internal experience rather than external experience. And the third argument is the moral argument. There are three forms of it. One is the natural law form. It assumes that there is a natural law of morality that do good and avoid evil, the golden rule, some sort of basic moral principle which just about all sane human beings hold to be true, is in fact true. And if it is true, if that is as true as, let's say, the design in the universe, there must be a cause for it. A law requires a lawgiver. Notice that the moral law does not simply describe how things do in fact work. It describes how we ought to work. So it's the kind of law that needs a lawgiver behind it. It's a thou shalt, rather than this happens. A second form, which doesn't presuppose a natural law of morality, which is no longer as popular as it used to be, presupposes only that each of us ought to obey his or her own conscience. Now, my conscience may tell me to do different things than yours. And it may not be true, I think it is, but it may not be true, according to many people, that there is any such thing as a universal natural law. In which case, there's only one moral imperative: always obey your conscience. I never met anybody who said, it's morally good to deliberately disobey your conscience. Well, why does conscience have absolute authority? If the origins of conscience are simply this worldly, if conscience is simply the voice of society or the superego or tradition or your parents or primeval guilt or some other such thing, maybe it's just an animal trick for survival, why treat it as if it's a prophet of God and bow down to it? And yet everyone does seem to treat conscience as an absolute. What other than a perfect God would be the adequate explanation for the moral authority of conscience? The third version of the moral argument is the argument from love. Unselfish love, love of the other qua other, respect for the other as an absolute, Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative, treat all human beings as ends and not simply as means. This is almost universally recognized as morally right and proper, and a high and enlightened morality. Well, according to atheism, the love ethic is simply our idea or our will, and there is nothing more than that behind it. The nature of things, the nature of everything outside human consciousness, including the universe and including anything else, if there is anything else, has nothing whatsoever to do with love. Now, the universe doesn't seem to have much to do with love. The universe is nature red in tooth and claw. Evolution doesn't work through love. Animal life doesn't work through love. Gravity is a kind of form of love among the particles, but it's not really love. If theism is true, love goes all the way up. If theism is true, the fundamental principle of human ethic, namely that we should love each other, fits with the fundamental nature of ultimate reality, namely God, who is totally unselfish love. Now, there may be no proof that such a God exists, but the consequences of believing that such a God exists are that your ethic has a foundation in ultimate reality rather than simply in your desires, which is a pretty big payoff. A fourth argument, also psychological rather than cosmological, is the argument from desire, made famous by C.S. Lewis and based basically on the most famous sentence, probably, that any Christian outside the Bible ever wrote, the sentence in Augustine's Confessions, where Augustine says to God, "You have made us for yourself, and therefore our hearts are restless till they rest in you." If you once admit the premise of this argument, the data for this argument, it seems very strong. You can deny the premise. It's not an a priori premise. It's not a self-evident premise. It's an empirical premise. Most people discover within themselves a desire that nothing in this world has ever satisfied, can ever satisfy, or could even be imagined to satisfy. Most of us have a lover's quarrel with the world. Pascal begins his Pensées by saying, there are four things that are quite certain. Number one, everyone desires certainty about everything important. We want to know everything there is to know. Number two, nobody does it. Nobody gets it. Number three, everybody wants perfect happiness. Deep, perfect, non-boring, lasting happiness. Number four, nobody gets it. In other words, the best philosopher to start with is Mick Jagger. You can't always get what you want. Now, what's the explanation for that? Why do we desire something that eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has entered into the imagination of man? Well, look at all our other desires. You can classify them into two groups. There are external conditioned desires, like the desire for a Red Sox World Championship, or the desire for a Cadillac, or desire to fly through the air like Superman, or the desire to go to the land of Oz, which comes from something accidental and culturally relative. Second, there are desires which are innate and universal, like the desire for food and water and sleep and sex and society and knowledge and beauty. These come from our very nature. They're innate. Every single case of an innate desire corresponds to something real. It seems that we are incapable of desiring what does not exist. You might not get it. You might die of starvation. But if there is hunger, there is food. But there is hunger for something like God, or something like life with God, or something like heaven. So it's at least a very strong clue, at least a very strong argument from analogy, that such an object exists. Finally, I have a fifth argument, which is a weak one. Weak arguments are good. Most arguments are not demonstrative. They're probabilistic. Dr. Tooley's argument is probabilistic. So is mine, but it's not mathematical. It's sometimes called the argument from common consent. If you take a poll of all the human beings in the history of the world, you'll find that about 95% of them have had some sort of religious beliefs and have believed in something superhuman, maybe not the whole theistic package that's described here, certainly not in ancient times, but the number of atheists in the history of the world has been few and far between. Therefore, if you are an atheist, you must believe, as Freud did, that the vast majority of all human beings in all times, places, and cultures have been seriously deluded about the thing that matters the very most to them. In other words, we're all like Jimmy Stewart in Harvey. You know that old movie? Harvey is an invisible rabbit. Jimmy Stewart's in his 40s, but still like a little kid, he believes in this invisible friend. And he's the most important person in his life. Well, if God doesn't exist, we're all Jimmy Stewart, because God's just a big, big Harvey. So we're nuts. We're crazy. To believe that the vast majority of human beings have guided their lives by insanity, at least is problematic. Not necessarily problematic in a kind of probability calculation, but problematic in a very human way. You have to be a snob. Now, Professor Tooley is an honest and humble man, and he's not a snob, but his philosophy is a philosophy that invites snobism. We are the atheists, we the few, we the smarts. The whole human race is nuts. Especially the man that almost everybody, Christians and non-Christians alike, regard as a sage, a wise man, and a very good man, namely Jesus of Nazareth, was the stupidest man who ever existed, because no one who ever lived guided his life more by God than he did. He said, I came into the world not to do my own will, but the will of my Father. He said, my teaching is not mine, it's my Father's. So here's total Harvey. So I think it takes a bit of arrogance to say Jesus was the most idiotic man who ever lived. But that's the price you have to pay for atheism. I think it's not a price worth paying.
Thank you. Professor Tooley, a 5-minute response.
Right, thanks. Dan needs to keep an eye on the time, actually, and let me know when I'm going beyond 5 minutes.
Sure.
Let me just remark before I begin that when I've been in debates of the existence of God, they tend to be of two sorts. One with William Lane Craig offered 6 arguments for the existence of God. Peter hasn't quite gotten to 6, but there's a number there, right? I had a debate with Peter van Nieuwenhuizen, and he offered 0, a rather different thing. So I'm going to just comment on the arguments, and we'll see how far I get and stop at the appropriate point. Okay, so the first was sort of a version of a first cause argument, and the focus was on different theories of the physical universe and so on. And Peter made the point quite correctly that scientists today accept the idea that our physical universe began at a certain point in time. The Big Bang theory is accepted. But there are 2 points made about this argument. The first point is that the Big Bang theory doesn't entail that our physical spatial temporal world is not part of a larger material spatial temporal world. And a number of scientists accept the idea of a multiverse. They think there are a number of island universes, right, in a much larger realm, right? And so that means that there's a possibility that the spatial temporal world that we live in, though it only goes back to a certain point, could have been caused, so to speak, by a larger physical realm, right? And so there's no need to postulate the existence of the immaterial cause. The second and the most important point, though, is that this is not really an argument for the existence of God. Think back to my default argument, right? And so the idea is that there are these different possibilities concerning omnipotent, omniscient beings, okay? Could be perfectly good, could be perfectly evil, could be perfectly indifferent, right? And the argument that Peter Kreeft presented, this first argument, doesn't show, for example, that it's less likely that there's a morally indifferent one or less likely there's an evil one, and so it cannot raise the probability that God exists above what it has on the default approach, that is 1/3. The second thing you mentioned was the argument from design, and here I wanted to distinguish between the existence of order in the sense of complex ordered structures like the human body, the solar system, and so on, and the existence of order in the sense of regularities, or as I would prefer to say, laws of nature. And here the point is that in the case of complex ordered structures, I would maintain that they can be given evolutionary explanations. I'm thinking not just the biological theory of evolution, but the theory of, the evolution of the physical universe itself, right? I know that Peter is skeptical about the biological theory of evolution, but I think that the grounds that he offers on his website are not strong ones. Then, of course, there's the problem of laws, and what I would argue there is that you're stuck with laws of some sort on any view. And the reason is, if you consider things like powers or dispositions, of course, omnipotence and omniscience are powers, right? But think about water's solubility. What makes, a piece of sugar water soluble? And the answer is that it has certain properties that, together with the laws of nature, entail that if it's put in water, then it will start to dissolve, right? And so I maintain the general thesis that powers and dispositional properties logically supervene upon laws. And so if you think of God as being omnipotent, omniscient, having those powers, then there must be laws that govern supernatural nature. So there's no scenario in which you can explain all laws. You're always left with some laws that must be treated as brute facts. The third argument mentioned dealt with conscience and morality. And one of the main points I want to make here is that if you think about basic moral truths, it may be, for example, that inflicting pain upon innocent individuals is bad and so on, right? Think about basic moral truths. It seems to me very plausible to think that those are not contingent truths, but necessary truths. One way of putting it is that they're truths that are going to attain any possible world. Well, on the other hand, I would argue there are good reasons for thinking that no concrete being, whether it's a material being or an immaterial being, can be necessarily existent, right? This is connected with the ontological argument. I think just as there are good objections to the ontological argument for the existence of God, there are good objections to any claim that there can be, so to speak, a person whose existence is logically necessary. What follows from those 2 points? What follows is there'll be worlds where there is no omnipotent, omniscient being, but there'll still be the same basic moral truths. And so this shows that moral truths cannot be dependent upon the existence of any concrete entity such as a deity.
Can I stop you there?
Okay, yes, thank you.
Professor Kreeft.
Small time for many ideas. You gave 2 arguments, the a priori argument and the a posteriori argument. Let me address each briefly. Each time you mentioned the a priori argument, you calculated probabilities in terms of number of possibilities. There's only 1/3 probability that God exists because either he's non-existent or existent but not good, whatever the calculation. And then later, at the end, when you talked about the problem of evil, you said, well, if God allows evil, then he allows things that have certain wrong-making properties and certain right-making properties, and let's calculate the number of possibilities. And your first calculation on the rectangle was that it's 3 times more likely that an act that God tolerates is morally wrong. I'm not a mathematician, but I think that's confusing 2 different kinds of probability. The probability of a proposition being true and the probability of an event taking place. Pascal argues against Descartes' universal doubt that either our minds have been designed by a God who is wise and trustable, or else they are hypnotized by Descartes' evil demon, which he uses as a thought experiment to raise doubt to the nth degree, or else they have not been designed at all, but just evolved by chance. Since our minds are at least deeply connected to our brains, and since our brains resemble in many ways computers, the analogy with a computer is relevant. Now, would you trust a computer that had been programmed by mere random chance? Or would you trust a computer that had been programmed by someone who was wicked or stupid? No. You trust a computer only if its hardware has been designed by somebody wise and trustable and good. Well, if your mind is like computer hardware, since there's 3 possibilities, and God is only one of those 3 possibilities, couldn't you calculate that there's only 1/3 of a chance that our minds are reliable? And if they're not reliable, then the fundamental principles that we can't doubt, that are in there as hardware, like the law of non-contradiction, may not be true of the real world. In which case, not only all of philosophy and common sense, but all of science goes by the boards. I think that's a reductio ad absurdum argument. I don't think the mind can eliminate itself in that way. But you do if you calculate probabilities in that way. The second, much more interesting argument was about the problem of evil, which is an a posteriori argument, that evil makes it unlikely that God exists. Well, God certainly allows evil. Certainly a miracle-working God could put a stop to all evil. Let's take the evil that you yourself admit is not the least, you say last but not least, namely human mortality, death. Death is total loss. You might lose your hearing, you might lose your limb, you might lose your job, but if you lose your life, that's it, unless you believe in reincarnation. You don't come back. Now, here's an illustration of how God allows something that we don't see how it's good very well, but it still may be good. Nobody likes to die. Nobody likes to suffer. Nobody likes pain. And yet, suppose there were no death. You said, last but not least, there's the problem of human mortality, unfortunately. Well, is that unfortunate? Suppose we discovered the immortality pill. What would our lives be like? I think you can get an analogy for that by taking a dozen eggs and putting it in the center of your kitchen for about a month. If we're programmed to hatch, then if we don't, we go bad, we go rotten. Science fiction is full of stories about a race that achieves artificial immortality and goes rotten. For instance, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, where this race of extraterrestrials comes to solve all human problems, war, poverty, ignorance, superstition, and it does, and everybody's immortal, and everybody's so bored that they want to commit suicide. Here's an illustration of a very great evil, which seems to outweigh many other evils, probably outweighs all other physical evils, which nevertheless is absolutely necessary. My answer to the problem of evil is basically Job's answer. If we could figure out why God allows evil X, Y, and Z, the tsunami, for instance, that would count against the theistic God, not for him, because that would mean that there is no superior intelligence that surprises us, that God is not even like Daddy, who often allows Junior to suffer by, for instance, not doing his homework or making him ride the bike himself and fall off. And Junior doesn't understand why Daddy doesn't do all this stuff for him. And I think we can use, once again, at least a reasonable analogy for this in our own experience. The wise parent often tolerates foreseen suffering in the child for a greater good that the child cannot understand. That's at least believable. It's not provable, but it's believable. And that's all we need to solve the problem of evil, because the problem of evil claims that evil refutes God. I'm not saying that it proves God, but at least the refutation can be declawed.
Thank you.
What's the format here? Do we go on?
Another 5, and then a question.
I mean, should the folks on Peter just said on occasional things?
Whoever you'd rather.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to continue on commenting on some of Peter's earlier arguments, since I'd like to sort of complete that section. And a fourth argument he mentioned was the argument from desire. And the main idea is in that argument, as I understand it, was that, first of all, that all natural desires are desires that can be satisfied. But secondly, that there's a natural desire in us human beings for something that, so to speak, cannot be satisfied by the natural material world, right? So let me comment on that. First of all, I'm not convinced that all natural desires can be satisfied. It seems to me that one desire that's quite a natural desire is to avoid bodily death, right? And one wants to avoid bodily death not just here and now on a particular occasion, one wants to avoid it tomorrow and so on, right? And so it seems to me that there is in human beings a natural desire to never undergo bodily death, right? And I think one can see why that's a natural desire and why if you accept evolution, you'd expect that sort of thing to be programmed into it, because if you don't care whether or not you're, so to speak, going to die, then when the tiger comes into the room, you may say a nice cuddly cat and so on, right? And your life will come to a rather quick end, right? So to expect evolution to program in a desire for survival, right? But the desire to avoid bodily death is not a desire that can be satisfied. So I'm not convinced that the idea basically is that desires can develop and they can become stronger in a certain sort of way, and they move from desires that may be able to be satisfied initially to desires that can't be so satisfied. But secondly, this idea that desires in people that, so to speak, are aimed at something that the natural world can't survive. Now, I may be a shallow person here, but let me put it this way. When my life is free of pain, when my natural needs are satisfied, when I have close friends around me, and when I'm able to pursue philosophical problems and think about them, I think I'm perfectly happy, right? And I don't think that I need anything beyond that, right? And so, I mean, Peter tends to put things in terms of sports cars and sex and money and so on, right? But I think if you think in terms of, for example, cultural and intellectual pursuits, right? I'm not convinced there's anything shallow in the idea that a life that has those things together with, I say, freedom from pain, satisfaction of natural needs, close friendships, is in any way either a shallow life or an unsatisfactory life. There was the argument from common consent that Peter put forward, and there are a couple of things I want to say about that. The one is that common consent really conceals a lot of differences, and so if you look back in human history, it was really quite late on the scene when monotheism appeared, right? It appeared in Israel and appeared in Egypt. But before that, you had polytheistic religions, and the gods were typically ones that provide explanations for various natural phenomena, right? And so it isn't that, so to speak, there's been a universal monotheism from the word go. I mean, monotheism is something that gradually evolved from polytheistic religions, and I think that one can understand without looking down on ancient people why they came to postulate these various deities. So that's one point. The second point may be moving in the direction of arrogance, okay? But when you look at studies that have been done of the relation between religious belief and education, there are studies that show that as the level of education rises, the extent of religious belief declines. They also show that exposure to scientific perspectives leads typically to decline in religious commitment. And so here's one figure just to throw out. There was a survey done in 1998, and a report on it was published in the prestigious journal Nature, and it was entitled, "Leading Scientists Still Reject God." And the figures that were published there had the result that if you consider not God as some sort of unknown force, but a personal deity, which is what we're talking about, right, that only 7% of top scientists believed in God. These were members of the United States National Academy of the Sciences, right? And so the question is, what's the explanation of that? Are these people somehow peculiarly evil or peculiarly blind and so on? Why does religious belief fall to those levels in this group, right? And I suggest it's because that people in that group have learned to think more critically about their beliefs, right? I think ordinary people could learn the same critical abilities, right? And I think they'd be led to the same conclusions. I think quite ordinary people can reach those conclusions. One brief story. I have a grandson. I have actually 4 grandchildren named Anthony. And Anthony at one point was being exposed to biblical stories by his mother's boyfriend, who thought that Anthony had been insufficiently exposed to the truths of Christianity and so on. And one of the stories he was exposed to was the story of Noah. And later on, at one point, I never told Anthony about my own lack of religious beliefs. I just wandered into the kitchen. He was living with us for 3 years. And I said, I wonder if someone should write a book, how many dinosaurs are on the ark? I'd read some creationist stuff, right? At which point Anthony said, if there were a good God, he wouldn't have drowned all those animals, would he? Right? Now, this is just an ordinary boy, a 7-year-old, right? And yet, I think there's an ability to think critically about things. I think that ability could be very widespread. And I think if it were very widespread, that religious belief would be a much more common thing.
Very good. Thank you.
5 arguments, 1 minute for each one. We'll go backwards. Start with the common consent argument. I don't think that common consent proves theism, because theism is in ancient times a minority position. I meant that common consent refutes atheism. General religious belief is much more common than monotheism, monotheism more common than creationism, creationism more common than Trinitarianism. As you get to the less common, you get more surprises, which is also true in the history of science. There was a poll of scientists' religious beliefs that I read about maybe 10, 15 years ago. And it's true, very many scientists are atheists, but the particular science that you work in determines a lot what you believe. As you get down into psychiatry, sociology, and psychology, you get a massive number of atheists. As you rise into astronomy and cosmology and cell biology, you get a significant rise in the number of theists. So I think that the study of human disorder naturally makes you question your faith quite properly, whereas the study of natural order naturally leads to it. About the argument from desire, I don't think there are any unsatisfiable natural desires. I don't think that if we are wise and understand what we really want, we do want to avoid all kinds of death forever and go on living like bored, rotten eggs forever in this world. Ever read Tuck Everlasting? And the old myths have that too. Tithonius the Greek, the Wandering Jew, these are all curses of immortality. I think what we want is resurrection. We do indeed want a body. And we love this body, and we want something like this body to exist forever, but not under present conditions. We want some sort of transformation that we don't fully understand. And Christianity presents us with a very surprising view of resurrection, a transformation that we don't quite understand. I'm not accusing you of being shallow, but I do remind you that most atheists, I think, would disagree with you when you say, I can be perfectly happy just surrounded by good friends and good philosophy and an absence of pain. Even Sartre once wrote, there comes a time when one asks, even of Beethoven, even of Shakespeare, is that all there is? Money may not make you happy, but it certainly relieves a lot of suffering and solves a lot of problems. And the suicide rate among the rich is very significantly higher than the suicide rate among the poor. It seems then that to be perfectly happy in this world is just not possible, because the closer you get to it by controlling your world, by money, the more you think life is so boring you blow your brains out. 2 other rather technical points. I'm not sure just how you connected this with the moral argument, but you argued that God's existence is not logically necessary. That's the fallacy of Anselm's ontological argument, and I quite agree. That is a fallacy. I'm not saying that God's existence is logically necessary. It's ontologically necessary. And one other qualification about the first cause argument. You admit that all scientists accept a Big Bang, but you say perhaps that's just the most recent Big Bang, and that's spatio-temporally derivative from a multiverse. Well, that, it seems to me, I stand corrected by people who know much more about cosmology than I do, that, it seems to me, is to revert to Newtonian absolute time. If all time came into existence relative to the matter of this universe, if it's an absolute singularity, then you can't say that, well, before the Big Bang there was a larger and older universe from which ours is derivative.
The number of people that I've encountered in those departments, but also philosophers I met elsewhere, the proportion who believe in the existence of a personal omniscient deity is really quite small. Okay? In my department at present, possibly there are 2 or 3, and one is borderline, right? He's a person named Wes Morriston who describes himself as a Christian but doesn't believe in the resurrection, thinks the Bible is morally dangerous and so on, right? So he's an unusual case, okay? Now, I don't think that, it'd be surprising if somehow philosophical training led to one's, not wanting to believe in the existence of God. I mean, my view is that the existence of God, not the existence of the Christian God, incidentally, okay, thinking of hell and final judgment, okay, but the existence of God that was generally all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, that'd be a tremendous thing. They wouldn't sure they were in the best of all possible worlds, but it'd be much better chance of being in a very good world, right? So, I mean, I would love it to be the case that I'm mistaken on this matter, okay, but I think it's very unlikely, right? And so the question is, if it really would be a great thing if there were an omni-deity of the sort that I defined at the beginning, right, and not a heaven and hell type deity, then why do you think it is that so many people who, are trained to think deeply about things, to consider arguments pro and con, who learn how to think critically, why do you think it is that such a small proportion of contemporary analytical philosophers believe in the existence of such a deity?
Good question. Two answers. Number one, they misunderstand God. They define God simply as the deist God who gives the two things that Freud says that we believe in God for. First of all, an enviable explanation of the universe. I've got all the answers, here they are. Secondly, a kind of benevolent protection, like Big Daddy in the sky. The functional existence of religious belief among many religious believers focuses on those two attributes of God, and that looks suspiciously like wishful thinking. So I think Freud was a very honest scientist and did a very thorough job from the atheist perspective in explaining the origin of popular religious belief. And as we know in the history of science, the universe is seldom what we expect. That's the kind of God people want and expect. That's not the kind of God you get. The kind of God you get in the Bible, the kind of God you get in Orthodox Judaism and Christianity and Islam, with significant differences, is indeed a God with the heaven and hell package. Because here's a God who seems terribly wrathful in the Old Testament, who nevertheless says he's loving. Well, that's a mystery. Like Daddy. Daddy hates me, says the 2-year-old. No, Daddy loves you. That's why he's disciplining you. Hell is certainly the most difficult package in Christian theism to defend. But if you scratch the doctrine of free will, you find necessarily entailed the doctrine of hell. If God is not a rapist, but only a seducer, then he will eternally allow you to say no to him. The difficulty in the doctrine of hell is not that it maligns God, it's that it maligns us. We've got to be crazy. That's one of my answers. The other answer is I think it is true that as people get more educated, they tend to lose religious belief. And the psychological reasons for that are complex and multiple. But one of them, I think, can be seen from a study that some Harvard sociologist made of Hitler's henchmen. She was looking at the level of education among the people that volunteered to do Hitler's dirty work in the concentration camps. And she thought that whatever the moral scruples of these people, the more educated they were, the more sensitive they would be to human pain, and the more reluctant they would be to administer the terror in the death camps. So she thought she was going to find a definite correlation between level of education and reluctance to support Hitler. Well, she found a correlation, but it was exactly the opposite. The more educated the people were, the more fanatical they were in favor of Hitler. So education is not an infallible prescription for wisdom. And the theistic answer to why so many smart people are atheists has something to do with the one vice that only among religious people, I think, is regarded as a terrible vice. It's called pride. Pride over against other human beings is generally recognized as a vice. It's essentially competitive. I've got to be better than you. But if there's a God, pride over against God is also a vice. So there's got to be mystery, and there's got to be humility, and there's got to be, God, I don't understand this, but I just trust you. Because if God is love, love wants trust. Lovers are never known to propose in syllogisms.
Thank you. I'll give you a chance to ask a question.
Yes. Well, I guess my question is, one thing we know for sure, we're all going to die. And I guess I'm asking you the question that Bertrand Russell's friend asked him on his deathbed. What if you die and you find out that there is a God after all, and it's the Christian God? What would you say to him?
Well, I think that you probably know this better than I do, that Russell's answer was something like, not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence, okay, right? And I mean, it's a difficult situation, and it's difficult because of, as you mentioned, that hell is one of the more difficult parts of the Christian thing to defend. And so if I'm confronted not just with God as I described him initially, an omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect being, right? I mean, that would be a God with a sense of humor, right? It would be God who would not be offended because Michael Tooley, thought he could prove his non-existence and so on, right? And so I would have no worries at all about meeting that sort of God. In fact, I'd be delighted, right? That would be the best of all possible outcomes and so on. But if I meet the Christian God, then I'm in deep something or other, right? And so on. In all probability, right? Okay. I mean, not absolutely clear, but I think the case is not good. I mean, the reason I say I'm in deep trouble is that I can remember a story that my teacher told, Walter Kaufmann, a translator of Nietzsche and so on. And he was attending a seminar that was being taught by Rudolf Bultmann. Rudolf Bultmann is probably not a familiar name, but he was a Christian theologian, but of an extremely liberal sort who wanted to get rid of miracles and all the, what he called mythological stuff in the Christian religion and so on. And Kaufmann was attending this seminar taught by Bultmann, and presumably the seminar was taught in German, and Kaufmann grew up in Germany and so spoke German. And he asked, Kaufmann was struck by the fact that in this 2-volume work that Bultmann had done, there was no reference to hell at any point in the 2-volume work, Theology of the New Testament. And so he asked Bultmann what his views were on hell. And Bultmann's reply was that he thought that he agreed with Lessing. Now, Kaufmann remarks that Bultmann probably expected the conversation to stop at that point because this was sort of a German scholarly setting and so on, and that Bultmann expected Kaufmann would then go to the library and look through, I don't know, the 45 volumes of the collected works of Lessing to try to find what Lessing's view was. And but Kaufmann simply said, and what was Lessing's view? And Bultmann's response was he thought that what Lessing had said was that if even a single soul were to go to hell, that he, Lessing, would refuse to go to heaven. I told this story to a friend of mine who was, as a graduate, an atheist and humanist, and became a minister. And his response was that Bultmann would not get the opportunity. Right? So my feeling is that the idea that there is, so to speak, a final judgment when one's destiny for all eternity is fixed, right? There's no chance beyond that for prodigal sons and daughters to change their mind and turn to a loving deity, right? I believe the notion of a final judgment is morally really quite unacceptable. And I think that the addition to it of the idea that there is a place, so to speak, where regardless of whether or not one is suffering physical pain, one is, so to speak, undergoing a state which is worse than torture, okay, right? I think, again, that's morally unacceptable. I think that's a view that would be widely shared, indeed, by contemporary ethical philosophers. So, I mean, it's hard to say what one would or would not have the courage to say in that situation, right? But I think that, that if one had the courage, what one should do is protest against the universe that's been set up in this sort of way.
Thank you. Mr. Kreeft, the closing argument?
I'm not going to give a closing argument. I'm going to give a closing. Pascal says there are only 3 kinds of people in the world. Those who have sought God and have found him, and these people are reasonable and happy. Reasonable because they've sought and happy because they've found. Secondly, those who are searching but have not found God and do not believe, and these people are reasonable because they search, but they're unhappy because they haven't found. Thirdly, those who neither seek God nor find him, and these people, says Pascal, are unreasonable as well as unhappy. The difference between heaven and hell is not the difference between believers and unbelievers in this scheme. It's between seekers and non-seekers. Now, Professor Tooley is a seeker. A philosopher is almost by definition a seeker. And he has said numerously that he wishes that there were a God, or that he wishes that there were no death, or, unfortunately, the argument proves atheism. Well, in that case, I think he's going to heaven. Because the very first words out of Jesus' mouth in John's Gospel are, "What do you want?" That's very similar to the Hindu myth of the wishing tree. Although there it has to do with reincarnation and karma, the point is psychologically the same. We all get what we want. It certainly seems as if the fundamental principle of human life is Mick Jagger's. You can't always get what you want. But maybe in the end, justice will be done and we will all get what we want. Now, Professor Tooley's main argument against God, I think, is the moral argument, and that's certainly the strongest one. He strikes me as a kind of an intellectual version of Ivan Karamazov, who rejects God because God seems to run the world very badly. And whatever manager allows innocent people to die is not a good manager that he wants to live with forever. And I think God will respect that. One of my favorite writers is Camus, who was, of course, an atheist. But one of the most compelling figures in world literature is Dr. Roux in his novel The Plague. Dr. Roux decides to stay in Africa and minister to the people dying with the plague, even though he has a comfortable home and wife waiting for him in Europe, because he knows that he's their only hope and he can save maybe thousands of lives. Of course, he'll die himself. Why does he do that? Well, he says, I know that the meaning of life is to be a saint. And of course, you can't be a saint without God. And there is no God. So those three propositions are logically inconsistent. And he can't deny any one of those three propositions. He tries to. He can't. He can't deny his atheism, he can't deny the logical connection between a saint and God, and he can't deny that the meaning of life is to be a saint. So I hope that Professor Tooley, like Dr. Roux, is conflicted, and the conflict will end at death. So I wish you a good death.
Right, thank you very much, Peter. Right. Okay. Mine will be more of a summary. In brief, I've offered two arguments for the existence of God. One is what Peter calls the moral argument, the argument from evil. And I think it's important, though, to note certain features of the argument that I offer. I think there are a number of versions of the argument from evil that are unsound, ineffective, right? And the features of mine are, first, that it's a probabilistic argument, but secondly, that it focuses upon concrete cases. And so, one of the cases I mentioned in passing was the case of the fact that humans are mortal and so on. Peter, like Walter Kaufmann, isn't convinced that immortality of the sort I have in mind here is a good thing. I once asked a colleague of mine, Steve Leeds, if he'd like to live forever. And he said, well, 500 years might be okay, but anything beyond that would not be good. I don't share that view, right? If you said either you must, take what you have or take, natural immortality with a body that doesn't grow old and memory doesn't fail and so on. But if you make that choice, it's a final choice. You can never escape, right? There's no escape from you can't commit suicide at some point saying, hey, I wasn't too smart on that choice, right? I would choose without hesitation because it seems to me there can be a succession of Bachs and Beethovens and so on. There can be intellectual puzzles in various areas, mathematics, physics, philosophy. There can be very simple pleasures like playing 8-ball and so on, right? Which combines, a certain amount of intellectual stuff and a certain amount of physical coordination, etc. But it's not too challenging, etc. I find that when there are things that I like to do, I can do them on a, so to speak, not exactly constant basis. I wouldn't want to play golf every day of the week, right? But playing golf, once a week, every 2 weeks, that's perfectly fine and doesn't, grow thin or boring and so forth and so on. So I think that the idea of natural immortality is actually quite an attractive one. But that's not the crucial point. The point is simply That's one example which you and I disagree about, okay? But there are other cases like, e.g., for example, the Lisbon earthquake, famous case, or the South Asian tsunamis that killed more than 200,000 people, or things like the Holocaust and so on, right? And the idea is that if you know there's a God, you can look at those things and say, oh, yes, there must be a reason, right? But if you don't come from that position, right, and you look at those things as closely as you can, in many cases, as I think most theists would admit, including, for example, Plantinga, you just can't see any right-making characteristics that are present in that case that outweigh the horrific wrong-making characteristics that are all too apparent, right? Well, where does that leave you, though, if you're a believer? Well, you have to ask yourself whether you have grounds for belief that really counter the argument from evil. And one of the points I made earlier tonight is that there are some arguments for the existence of God, sort of first cause arguments, unmover type arguments, a variety of things, right, that don't do that. There are arguments that clearly do, things like the ontological argument, but I think Peter and I share the view of the ontological argument is problematic. There are other arguments that are a little more difficult to deal with, like arguments for miracles. I think in those cases that one can, for example, make out a strong case that actually there aren't any good candidates for miracles. And I could refer to a number of things at this point, but I won't do so. My point is that you have to ask of any argument that's put forward as an argument for the existence of God, whether it counters the argument from evil. You also have to ask whether it counters my initial default argument, because if it doesn't show that the initial likelihood of an omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect being is raised up by lowering down the alternatives to it, e.g., omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly evil, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly indifferent, then it cannot, so to speak, make belief in God reasonable, right? And my overall view is that there's no argument that can succeed in doing that. So I think that in the end, the default argument and the argument from evil carry the day. Thank you very much.
Our debaters have agreed to answer some questions from the audience, if there are any.
I said, first, we've established that we can't, with complete certainty, prove or disprove God. There's a very low probability on one side and a very high on the other side, it seems. But is there any benefit in actually, since we're not of necessity deluding ourselves, thinking as if there is one or as if there isn't one? And what socially, morally, anything like that?
Well, that's really the question Pascal addresses in the famous wager. Pascal, like you, thinks that there's no certain argument for or against the existence of God. So you have to wager one way or another. Imagine you're playing two games at once, one with blue chips and one with red chips. The blue chip game is the intellectual game. You want certainty, you want proof, you want knowledge. The red chip game is the happiness game. You want a better life, a happier life, you want happiness. You start with the blue chips, if you're honest. Otherwise, your happiness is false happiness. Pascal is assuming that you can't win the blue chip game. You can't prove that God exists, and you can't prove that he doesn't exist. So you have to wager on the red chips. And he argues that your only chance for happiness is to bet on God and to win. And your only chance for unhappiness is to bet against God and lose. Because if there's no God, there's no payoff. No life after death, no heaven, no hell, no last judgment, nothing. So it doesn't matter. You can recast that Pascalian wager in a much more moral tone as a wager for justice rather than for happiness. If there is a God, honor is due to him, and you should believe in him even if he doesn't exist, because that doesn't do any harm to anything that does exist. But if God does exist and you don't believe in him, that's doing a fundamental injustice. So if, as many religious people are, you are bothered by the selfishness of Pascal's wager, and it works on a very low and selfish level, it can be recast in a moral way. So something like that will move you, I think, in one direction or the other. You could equally argue that religion has done a lot of harm in history. And to avoid that harm, stop believing in God. So then you have to weigh the harm and the good that religion has done in history, and that involves the problem of what standard do you use. They have to be neutral standards. Such an argument isn't going to come to any conclusive conclusion, but it may be enough to motivate you. Meeting a saint may well motivate you to say, well, I don't know if God exists, but I want to be like that. But meeting a great religious hypocrite might do the opposite. Well, I don't know if there's a God or not, but I don't want to be like that. So I'd say that saints are the most effective argument for the existence of God.
Well, first thing I want to say is I think it's important not to assume too quickly that there's no good argument either for the existence of God or against the existence of God. It tends to be sort of a truism that you can't prove the existence of God or disprove the existence of God, right? And I think that people often accept that without looking carefully at the arguments on either side, right? My own view is that the argument from evil in the form I presented it is a sound inductive argument, right? And again, I say this is discussed in the book with Plantinga, so you can read the argument there in more detail, and you can read Plantinga's response and my response to Plantinga, and then see what in the end you think about the argument. The second point I want to make is that I think on the whole that one should base one's beliefs upon the evidence. David Hume remarked, the wise man or woman, we would say, or wise person, proportions his belief to the evidence, right? And so I think it's only in exceptional circumstances where one will want to believe something or believe it to an extent that wasn't justified by the evidence for and against it. What are the benefits? Well, again, Peter mentioned Pascal's argument. I think that he was using it in a different sort of way, but I think that Pascal's classic argument is quite an unsound argument. I think Christians often have difficulty seeing what's wrong with it. One way of doing so is to imagine that a Muslim Pascal puts forward the argument as grounds for the idea that it's in your self-interest to accept Islam and to believe in Allah, right? If you think through that and get clear about what's wrong with that, I think you'll see why the argument as a whole is unsound, because when you consider all the possibilities, both actual and possible, what happens is that they cancel out, and there's no benefit either in believing in a particular God or believing in, one God out of the many on offer, etc. Final point I want to make is that it does seem to me that if one thinks, as I do, that this life is all there is, I think there are excellent reasons for believing that humans do not have immaterial mortal souls. Peter would disagree. And if God does not exist, I think it's extremely unlikely one's going to be resurrected, and so I think one's chances of surviving death are essentially zilch, okay? If this life is all there is, then you need to take very seriously the problems that there are with the world as it stands, the evils that exist, because this is the only chance that people have for happiness, right? And so I think that not believing may have the benefit that one will have a more serious feeling about the need to correct the problems that there are in this world.
Thank you. All the way in the back, first hand I saw.
First of all, thank you very much for coming and speaking to us today. I had a kind of similar question. Whether or not God or a higher power exists, is there any benefit or drawback to the uncertainty, to the questioning, to the fact that, as it stands now, there is no absolute proof whether God does or does not exist? Thank you.
Again, from my point of view, there's no, so to speak, danger in questioning things and having doubts and so on. From the point of view of some religious views, I'm not saying Peter's, okay, right? There's a serious danger, okay, right? Because it may be held, for example, that if you once held on to the truth in question and then for some reason have abandoned it, then you're, so to speak, got a one-way ticket to hell, basically, be it an Islamic hell or a Christian hell, right? And so, from a religious point of view, it can be quite dangerous. And so when you look back historically and you look at the treatment of unbelievers, both also today, of course, but going back to the Middle Ages and so on, where a large number of heretics were put out of the world by death, right? the feeling was that, heretics, people like myself, are actually quite dangerous because they may convince you to abandon the truth that you have, right? But from a non-religious point of view, right, then no, you should follow all the arguments where they lead. You should see what the alternatives are, not just the alternatives that happen to be the ones that are around you in your society. You should look at other societies, other places, other times, and see what the best arguments are that can be put forward for those alternatives, and then choose. And you may, in the end, hover between different views. You may think a certain view is right, but not be completely sure about it, right? From my point of view, that's not crucial. Again, I might refer to Lessing. Lessing remarked at one point that not the truth in whose possession any man is or thinks he is, but the honest effort he has made to find out the truth constitutes the worth of man. And so similarly, I want to say, not the truth in whose possession any woman is or thinks she is, but the honest effort she has made to find out the truth is what constitutes her worth.
I agree with that principle, but not the version of it that you earlier quoted, which is Clifford's rule. We should always proportion our belief to the evidence. Suppose some policeman came in here and said, Professor Kreeft, come home with us. We just found that your wife had hacked off the heads of 13 neighbors, and we have sworn testimony to that effect. We have compelling evidence here. I would not believe the evidence. I would say, no, this is impossible. I know her better than you do. No matter what happens, she's incapable of that. Well, I'm not proportioning my belief to the evidence. I'm giving her the benefit of the doubt, which is what we want in interpersonal relationships. We don't govern our lives by Clifford's rule. When Romeo proposes to Juliet, she doesn't say, give me the evidence. He says, trust me, leap into my arms. And religion is more like a love affair than it is like a scientific hypothesis. So I think the whole debate has been wrongly skewered towards the analogy with a scientific hypothesis and the preponderance of evidence. The reason I think that's wrong is that the religious hypothesis is that religion is not simply a hypothesis, but a marriage proposal. And since we're talking about the consequences of religious belief, I disagree that if you believe this life is all there is, you'll find it more precious. I think you'll find it less precious. A woman who's carrying a baby that's dead is not going to take care of her pregnancy. If the baby is alive and she wants it to be, she'll take care of her pregnancy. The roads in the West that led to gold mines were well kept up, and the roads that led to ghost towns were not well kept up, and they were in disrepair. So if this whole world is a kind of a womb or road to heaven, it'll be more precious. And you find that in the history of Western civilization. The atheists have produced the death camps of Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao Zedong, and religious people have produced hospitals and Christian culture and Western civilization.
Yes, sir.
I think you both agree that one of the stronger arguments against theism is the argument from evil. And the examples that were given seem to be all about human suffering. For example, the tsunami. My question is, do we necessarily have to define evil as the thing suffered by people, even it being death, as opposed to something that people do? And how does free will from God play into that?
Well, I think we both agree about the logic of the argument. The real problem is indeed suffering, not sin. You can explain sin very simply. We do it, not God. If God gives us free will, we're to blame for the misuse of that, but we're not to blame for tsunamis. So that's the more serious problem. Nevertheless, moral evil hurts us more than physical evil. And I don't think you have to be an idealist to believe that. If you had the choice between losing your mind and losing the power of your body, paralysis in the mind of the body, most of us would choose paralysis of the body. To be alive and alert in a wheelchair is better than being insane. So the deeper evil is the moral and intellectual evil that comes from our folly and vice. And yet, that's the one that's more easily compatible with the theistic hypothesis that God, like a human parent, grants his children free will.
I don't think I have a great deal to add. I mean, there are evils other than evils of suffering and so on, lack of certain sort of knowledge and lack of close relationships with other people. There are a variety of things that one can mention. But what the argument for evil wants to do is to focus on those cases where if you suppose that you had greater power, you would think that you were under an obligation to intervene, okay, right? And the intervention might be the intervention in the form of, there's an undersea earthquake, right, which is going to produce tidal waves and so on, right? And you think that, if you could press a button and knock out that undersea earthquake, right, you would think that that's something you ought to do, right? But the same is true, of course, in the case of where people are using their free will badly, okay, right? If you see someone who's about to rape or murder some other individual, right, then you surely think that, you have an obligation to try and stop that if you possibly can, right? And so the idea is that you have the Nazis misusing their free will, doing heinously evil things, right? Again, the thought is that if you had the power, you ought to intervene, right? And so the question becomes, why is it that things are different in the case of God, right? And the answer is, well, God has reasons for not intervening, right? But let's say the thrust of the probabilistic version of the argument from evil is to say that's certainly a possibility, it can't be ruled out, but you have to ask whether it's probable or not. And the claim is that it's more probable than not that there aren't on-scene right-making characteristics that justify the allowing the otherwise morally wrong action in question.
Thank you. I see there's an enthusiastic line formed, so take questions that way.
We were encouraged to form a line.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yes.
I was listening to both arguments, and I have one question that I've had since the beginning. And even when coming from different backgrounds, one from philosophy or psychology or sociology or religion backgrounds, the questions have been in my head the whole time, so I'm sorry if I'm not as coherent as I want to be. Even when we look through, if there's math behind it, if 1 over n equals, and this is why I believe this, or even with yours it was more of a, not necessarily a plus b equals c, but this shows us this, and so we believe this. It's all very logical. And I feel as though that as a person of faith, where is faith in your argument? I don't believe that many people who say that they believe in God will say they believe in God because it's logical. They'll say because they have faith. And I'm curious as to where that devotion and that loyalty and that faith belongs in your arguments, because I kept listening for that word all night and I've been missing it. So I was curious how that works in with you.
I distinguish two answers to that question depending on what kind of faith you mean. If you mean intellectual belief, then that's often the best we can do, but it's not ideal. It's an opinion which we're not certain of, and we stake something on. It's imperfect. It's not as good as sight. And we hope that in heaven we'll have sight. You won't need faith in heaven. You'll see. But there's a second meaning to faith, and that's personal trust. That's paying a compliment to the other person in putting some aspect of your life in his or her hands. And that's an enormous compliment, and that's a virtue. I don't think there's any particular virtue in faith in the first sense. The New Testament describes faith in the first sense in rather uncomplimentary words in, I think, the letter of James. He says, "Do you believe that there is one God?" Ooh, good for you. The demons believe that too, but shudder with fear. So the faith that religious people value so highly is personal trust. And that's a thing that it's much more difficult to quantify or to put into relationship to logical argument than the first one.
Well, I guess I could say I'm sort of an anti-faith person, right? And I'm thinking not just of how did Mark Twain define faith, something like, believing what you know ain't true or something like that, right? I'm not just thinking of faith, which is, so to speak, believing something on the basis of insufficient evidence or believing it more firmly than the evidence merits. I'm also thinking of trust as well, because it seems to me that trust can be misdirected, okay, right? And so one may trust in religious leaders and so on, who, if followed, will lead one to engage in various very unfortunate acts indeed, right? And so I think that religious beliefs need to be open to the same sort of scrutiny that beliefs are in any other sort of area. And here's one way to think about it. I mean, you may feel that you have, a faith commitment to a certain set of beliefs, but suppose you've been born in a different part of the world. I mean, suppose you've been born in Saudi Arabia. Suppose you've been born in India, right, or in Japan. Statistics are that such that it's very probable you'd have different beliefs than the ones you presently have, right? And so the question is, if you look at things from that point of view, doesn't it suggest that, the perception you have that the faith you have is directed in the right direction, right? That things that you trust in are the right things to trust in, right? That you'd have the same sorts of feelings, but they'd be, so to speak, directed at other objects of trust and ones that are incompatible with the ones that you now trust and so on. So I very much agree with Sam Harris in his book, The End of Faith, that we need to become intolerant towards the idea that it's a good thing either to accept things on the basis of insufficient evidence or to believe them more strongly than the evidence warrants, or to refrain from subjecting them to critical scrutiny, or to trust in things where we can't give good reasons for thinking that trust is well directed, right? And so I think that faith is something that we should work to get rid of in the world. And I think that if we did that, much of the violence that you see in the world today and so on would no longer have the reasons it now has for existing.
I want to start by thanking you both very much for talking. I really appreciated all the insights that you provided. As both of you have professed, you're both very logical. And in philosophy, you realize that when you assert sort of these universal truths that you have, it really only takes one example to sort of flip that truth on its head. And I have a question for both of you, but I'm going to specify it, so that way I actually get different answers. So, with one of your arguments, you had mentioned your conscience and love. Now, a counterexample to that would be a sociopath who can neither, or someone who has antisocial personality disorder, who can neither experience love nor has sort of a moral conscience. And on the opposing side, if we take the Big Bang Theory, and we take the law of centripetal force, then all planets and moons and everything should be spinning in the same direction. But if you look, for example, at Saturn's moons, there are actually a couple that are moving in the opposite directions, which would directly disobey all laws of physics and logic. So how would either of you approach these sort of things that sort of undercut some of your arguments?
You can't use the argument from conscience for someone to someone who has no conscience, or the argument from love to someone who has no love. And I don't see any logical connection at all between the direction of the spin of Saturn's moons and the probability even, much less proof that there is or is not a God.
Okay, very briefly, I mean, your argument was that you'd expect that spins are going in the same direction throughout the solar system. That's not something that's going to follow from the laws, and so it's a question whether there's good reason for thinking that initial conditions must be such to ensure that. And I can't see that so, because I think in some cases it's believed that that moons were not originally associated with a given planet. They were bodies that were captured, right? If you think about captured bodies, they could very well wind up spinning in a different direction.
I'd like to take it back to the argument of the first mover that was discussed earlier. You both agree that there must be some first mover. The question is whether or not that requires a belief in God, or if there can be some natural explanation for it. matter can either be in motion or at rest, and there's some degree of motion or rest. It can there's a scale that it can accord to, but it must not be the case that motion. It seems to me it must not be the case that motion originates from matter, because you can alter, or rather, because motion's not innate to it, but comes when energy is transferred, from some other piece of matter. But then, if motion doesn't have its origins in matter, it must be that it has its origins in some metaphysical substance. The only proposition I've ever heard for any kind of metaphysical substance is the substance of mind, sort of according to Descartes' argument of dualism. Doesn't that then suggest that there's some reason for believing that the physical universe has its origin in a metaphysical substance of mind, which would be a living God?
I don't think so, because we experience the interaction of mind and matter in our own selves. And it works both ways. If somebody slaps you in the face, that physical cause produces a mental change in you from happy to unhappy. On the other hand, your decision to lift your arm, which is purely mental, produces the physical change that you lift your arm. Now, I think you can argue to a first mover in either the purely material or the purely mental realms, but I don't think you can argue from one realm to the other.
Briefly, I don't see any problem in explaining, for example, motion simply in terms of material things. And the idea is that you can have laws of motion, for example, which will take you from a state where nothing is moving to a state where something is moving. So if you imagine, for some reason you just have two particles here, right? Then if you have a law of gravitation, be it Newtonian or relativistic, right? There'll be the equivalent of force which each exerts on the other, and so they'll start to move towards one another, right? And so you get an explanation of motion on the basis of laws of nature, and in this case you don't have any regress. It's not the case that, that you think, well, it couldn't be the case that A moves B and B also moves A, right? But the answer is that each exerts a force on the other, and in virtue of the force which they simultaneously exert on one another, equal and opposite forces, they both undergo acceleration and so move towards one another.
Firstly, I'd like to apologize if I'm going to be standing on my soapbox a little with this question, but I'd like to address each of you individually. Firstly, to a theist, I would argue against your argument for morality, in the sense that what if the basis for human morality originates in the Pleistocene with the Stone Age and humans living in small groups together, and morality being necessary in order to thrive in a small community? And how does that factor into the notion that true altruism may not exist with relation to God?
That's not morality, that's pragmatism. We must love one another or die. I won't hit you on the head, you don't hit me on the head, we both survive and we don't need aspirin. That's not obligation. Once you get from pragmatic morality to justice morality or obligation, you have a different kind of thing. It's what Aristotle called a metabasis eis allogenos, a going over into another genus. So we're talking about basically a kind of Kantian morality of absolute obligation, rather than simply a practical morality of how can we maximize benefits.
Okay, that was very helpful. And I know that this has already been brought up, but I would ask for more of a clarification in the sense that about the Big Bang Theory. Again, I'm on my soapbox here, but I'm of the personal belief that to the origin of everything that is possible, there has to be something supernatural, whether it be a conventional God or something unthought of. So I was wondering how you could address the origin of... I know you already said that there are possibly multiple universes, or there certainly are, but I was wondering how you would address the original universe, if there was one, being created by a supernatural being.
What I want to say is that if you think about some sort of principle of causation, and I want to interpret the principle of causation, I think possibly in a broader way than Peter does, okay? I would maintain that principle of causation doesn't just say that for any, so to speak, coming into being, there must be a cause, right? I want to say that if you have any, so to speak, state of affairs of a certain sort, right, there's got to be a cause of it. And here's the way to think about it. Think about conservation laws, okay? There's an electron here at a certain time, right? It didn't come into being here, right? But it exists only because there's an electron there earlier or at a slightly different location, right? And so if you think about that idea, right, and then you say, let's consider the totality of everything that exists, maybe the physical universe, maybe the physical universe plus God, right? It cannot be the case that the totality has a cause, right? Because a cause must be distinct from its effect, right? What can be the case is that part of the totality can cause the other part, but it can't be a cause of the totality as a whole, right? And so there's no objection, just as there's no objection to God being eternal, there's no objection in principle to a physical universe being eternal. The same principles of causation, the general one I mentioned, will apply in both cases.
First of all, I just want to thank you again for your time and your insightful arguments. I have a brief question for our atheist guest speaker. Briefly going over some of the biggest argument that you had was that God cannot exist because in order for God to exist, he must be morally perfect, and therefore death being the greatest of these evils, that this God cannot exist because such death occurs. I wanted to pose a question as to what you thought about the converse being true, about life being the greatest good then, if death is the greatest evil. Therefore, every life would counterbalance every death, thus voiding the argument. What are your thoughts on that?
The argument from evil can be paralleled by an argument from goodness, right? And so just one can argue that it's unlikely that there's an omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect being. One can argue it's unlikely there's an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly evil being, right? But I think the existence of both goods like life or life with certain qualities and the existence of evils like suffering and so on, what they point to is if there is a, so to speak, a deity of any sort, it's a deity who isn't, so to speak, strongly committed either to good or evil and is possibly morally indifferent. Or if there is no such being, what it points to is a universe that's indifferent to good and evil. And I think that's the most plausible conclusion to draw.
Hi. I have a question for Peter Kreeft. You mentioned earlier when you were talking about the state of the origin of the universe and how modern-day scientists believe in the Big Bang Theory and that there is a definite finite beginning and that we do no longer have the belief of, I guess, an infinite homeostasis, that the universe has always existed as such. And with those principles of causation, I'm just wondering, what would you say caused God?
By definition, God would be uncaused. So to ask what causes God is to ask what causes the being who by definition is uncaused, which is a self-contradiction. So the question really eliminates itself. But what's behind the question is the common fallacy of conceiving God as an entity in the universe, an entity that's part of the sum total, which is the notion that in a much more sophisticated way Professor Tooley also used last time. Here's God, here's the universe, here's the creator, here's the sum total of all things. Well, if that can be eternal, why can't a part of it be eternal? Well, because God is not that kind of thing. God is not a part, an ingredient in the universe, any more than Shakespeare is an ingredient in Hamlet. That's what's meant by saying that God is transcendent. It's not just that he's absent, it's that he's the uncaused cause of all things that are in need of cause. There are different ways to put this. One is the argument from motion, which I don't think quite works on a purely physical level. The other is the metaphysical version of the argument, which I think does work, namely God's essence is to exist, so he is the reason for his own existence. Everything else is contingent. It exists because of some external force or factor or cause.
very briefly, I mean, traditionally, there was a complaint that theists, in putting forward a certain sort of argument, would appeal to some sort of principle of causality and causation, which they applied to the totality of the physical universe, right? And they would use that to get to the existence of an immaterial cause of that, and then they would jettison the principle and not raise the question about God, right? And so it seems to me that, you know, there are these two very different possible worlds, one where there's a physical world that's eternal and goes back forever in time, another where there's a world that possibly doesn't go back forever in time and it's caused by God. But then it seems to me that if you accept a relevant principle of causation, then you have good reasons for thinking that that God must, so to speak, have existed going back indefinitely in time as well. The situation has changed a bit when you appeal to Big Bang cosmology, though, because then the idea is we have scientific reasons, so it's claimed for thinking that the universe is only finite in time, right? And then one can bring in God as an eternal object as a cause of that, right? And so the symmetry is broken down. My point was just that there are other possibilities besides that, including the idea of a larger hyperspace containing island universes, of which ours is one.
I had a very simple yes or no question for Dr. Tooley. I was wondering, based on your conclusion that therefore, unfortunately, God does not exist, I was wondering, would you prefer if God did exist?
Frank, I'm refrain from answering that yes-no. My view is that if God is taken as I defined him, as omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect, then I would much prefer that God existed to God's not existing. If, on the other hand, God is Allah, right, and those who don't believe are going to wind up spending eternity in hell and so on, then I would much prefer that Allah not exist. And my intolerance here is pretty general, right? I would equally much prefer that the God of Christianity did not exist, right? And so it depends on which God you're talking about. The gods of historical religions seem to me to be morally deeply problematic, right? But if God is really perfectly good, right, then it'd be a terrific thing if there was such a deity.
Just want to add one little correction to that, if I may. Christians believe that the God of Christianity is perfectly manifested, not in any merely logical argument, nor even in any other historical manifestation, but in Jesus Christ, who is the full manifestation of the very essence of God, who poured out his own being in self-sacrifice, which is about as moral as you can get.
I'm gonna ask the last question only because I know that Michael Tooley's car is here and he has to get to Boston, or he will not have a ride. But I will ask just a final couple of questions. I'm trying to summarize a few questions that were asked by students earlier at the dinner, and also just recently by a student here behind me. I apologize that they're both addressed to you, Professor Tooley, but I'll ask you, maybe you could just give a 1-minute response to both of them. The question of evil always sort of consistently appears in these style of debates on this question, questions that are germane to the topic of theism and non-theism. Tell us, you posited the notion of evil immediately from the beginning of your debate, inferring that there is some sort of moral law in which you sort of derive that meaning of evil. Just simply put, can you go on the record to say, how do you have a moral law without a moral lawgiver? In some cultures, people love their neighbors. In other cultures, they eat them. Why is one better than the other? And just go on the record for that. And the second is, a lot of students were asking, too, about this sort of basic question about the historicity of the empty tomb. What is your response to the empty tomb and the overwhelming amount of historical evidence, both from atheistic historians and theistic historians, of course, who say that there's really no answer for this, and subsequently the martyrdom of then those apostles who all suffered unruly deaths because of the fact that they believed that they saw the risen Lord?
Well, the second question is very big, okay, right? And so let's waive the 1-minute limitation under which we've been working recently. As regards the first, what I would say is that one needs to read the Euthyphro, right? And so you talked about lawgiver, okay, right? And so if the idea is that what sorts of things are right and wrong is a function of what an omnipotent, omniscient creator of the universe commands, right, then I think that there are strong objections to that view, and those are objections that would be accepted by many religious thinkers of the past, right? I'm not saying that's the only sort of theistic alternative on the table here, but the idea that, real standards of good and evil exist simply because a being has, issued certain laws, I think is very unsatisfactory for the reasons that were put in the Platonic dialogue by Socrates. I think there are other reasons as well. I mentioned the idea that basic moral truths should be necessary, right? And identifying morality with, the commands of a creator of the universe, or even identifying with, so to speak, the inbuilt nature of that creator, right, is problematic because it makes what's necessary dependent upon what's contingent. As regards your second question...
Wait, can I just say, but why are they necessary?
Sorry?
But why are they necessary? You just suppose that they were necessary.
Well,
why is morality itself even a given?
Well,
why is relativism not your God? I guess that's the ultimate question.
You can be a moral skeptic, but again, the reasons for being a moral skeptic are ones that you're not going to get any help with by importing theistic belief. What you'll have is someone who lays down rules, okay, but you won't be able to make sense of the idea they have a special moral status, right? Think again of, a perfectly benevolent deity and the commands that he might issue, and a perfectly malevolent deity and the commands that he might issue, right? I think there's an intuition that, that what's morally right and wrong isn't a matter of the accident of which of those deities happen to exist. It's something, so to speak, that is before those sorts of things, the way that, just as the deity cannot make contradictions true, so it seems to me that a deity cannot determine what's right and what's wrong. I would suggest that if you want to read things in this area, there are two books by colleagues of mine. One is by Mike Humer, who has written a book setting out and defending ethical intuitionism, and the other is a book by Graham Audie, Defending Value Realism. Okay, those are large issues that I really can't say more about. Your second question was regard to the empty tomb, and the thing is, what one has to do here is to look at that question in the whole context of the question of miracles, right? And there are a number of books that I think are extremely illuminating in this regard. One is a book by A.D. White entitled The History of the Warfare of Science with Theology Within Christendom. And he has a chapter on the growth of healing legends. And what he did was to look at the life of, I think, Francis Xavier. And he looked at the original letters of Xavier and his contemporaries, looking for descriptions of miraculous events, and found none, right? He then looked at later biographies, and he shows in that chapter how you can trace events forward from the initial description by Xavier or his contemporaries of events that were not miraculous, and how they gradually become miraculous and more miraculous, and so on. In the letters of Xavier and his contemporaries, for example, there are also no reference to any cases of resurrecting people from the dead. But as you move on through the biographies, you find that there are accounts, and the more you are from the time when Xavier lived, the more detailed accounts those are, where it took place, who was resurrected, who the witnesses were. In short, there is abundant evidence that there are growth of healing legends, right? There are also a number of books written in this century. The A.D. White book is 1896, but there's a book, Faith Healing by Lewis Rose, a book by William Nolan on healing, Search for a Miracle, and so on. There's a report done by the Committee of the Church of England around 1920. There's a report done by the Committee of the British Medical Association. There are a number of very powerful studies. Another is one by D.J. West of 11 Lourdes miracles, right? And the conclusion of all of these is that when you look at things closely, you don't have any candidates for miracles. You also see a lot of deception, and you see the growth of healing legends. So the question of the resurrection needs to be looked at in the whole context of what the evidence is for the occurrence of miraculous events. One last point. If you believe in miracles, one of the things that you probably believe in is that prayer is effective and that intercessory prayer can make a difference, not that it always will. But recently there have been studies done, experiments on intercessory prayer. One was done at Duke University, and one was the STEP project, which involved about 1,800 people and 6 medical centers, including the Mayo Clinic and the Harvard Medical School. And they studied whether or not prayer affected the results of surgery and the extent to which you had reduction in complications when people were prayed for. And the result was that no differences were found. So there is a wealth of material that one needs to look at in regard to this question.
Thank you for coming and for your very excellent questions. And thank you for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for putting this together, and for the Wheaton Conservatives and Wheaton College in general for having us here. And thank you to our presenters.